It may be celebrating 70 years, but does NATO have a future? As alliance members sit down for an anniversary summit in London, tensions out in the open over U.S. demands that fellow members pay more, over Donald Trump's nod to Turkey to cross into Syria and take on Kurdish militias, over the same Turks threatening to veto support for Russia-wary Baltic states and Poland if they don't back Recep Tayep Erdogan's offensive, and over French President Emmanuel Macron's warning that NATO was experiencing brain death. He insists it's to spark debate and jolt alliance members into action to define priorities and ensure that a body created for the Cold War remains relevant in these times of shifting alliances and asymmetrical warfare. Did Macron do right with his remarks? And what is the grand plan to ensure the long-term security of Europe at a time when, well, going it alone is making a comeback as a concept in the US, but also in Brexit-bound Britain, which is hosting this summit 9 days before a general election. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the future of NATO, and joining us, Mireille Clapeau, member of the French Parliament, and who hails from Emmanuel Macron's La République En Marche party. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to welcome as well former German ambassador to NATO, Joachim Biederlich. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening.
From Washington, foreign policy consultant Molly McHugh. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
And from Istanbul, journalist and commentator Yusuf Erim of TRT World. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, Donald Trump earlier in the day, in reaction to Emmanuel Macron's brain death statement, had some sharp words.
You can't go around making statements like that about NATO. It's very disrespectful.
It was in the morning. The tone singularly different, though, when the two found themselves in the same room. Now, more on this story now from Monty Francis.
My statements created some reactions and shake a little bit. A lot of people. I do stand by.
On Tuesday, French President Emmanuel Macron refused to back off comments criticizing NATO, saying in an interview that the alliance faced brain death because of the unpredictability under President Trump and strained relations with Turkey, also a NATO member.
And I'm sorry to say that we don't have the same definition of terrorism around the table. When I look at Turkey, they now are fighting against those who fight with us, who fought with us.
Turkey has come under criticism from France and other NATO countries for its action in Syria and its decision to buy Russian missile systems. Turkish President Erdogan said his country would oppose NATO's plan for the defense of Baltic countries if the alliance does not recognize groups that Turkey deems to be terrorists. For his part, Trump began the day calling Macron's brain death statement nasty and disrespectful, but alongside Macron Tuesday afternoon settled on a familiar theme of getting NATO allies to contribute more financially.
There are some countries that aren't fulfilling their commitment, and those countries are going to be dealt with. Maybe I'll deal with them from a trade standpoint. Maybe I'll deal with them in a different way.
As for NATO itself, Macron and others have accused the U.S. of weakening the alliance, citing a lack of coordination between the U.S. and Europe, something exemplified by President Trump's decision to withdraw troops from northern Syria without consulting NATO allies.
Joachim Biederlich, you're a veteran of many a NATO summit. Have you ever seen one like this before?
No. Frankly spoken, no. It's once again, at the same time, a typical summit in crisis. I go back to different NATO summits since what we call the official end of the Cold War. We are in another Cold War since a certain time. But on this way between, let's say, 1989 and 2019, NATO has had certain assessments, in my view, that hide to some extent the differences between us. And what NATO needs today, I think NATO is still useful, is still necessary. NATO needs a European complementary security defense policy, but NATO needs at the same time a new strategic concept.
You heard Emmanuel Macron there saying we need to agree on what our priorities are. And he said, for me, the priority is fighting.
His words about the brain death were, in my eyes, too harsh, yes. But on the other hand, what did he wanted to say is, dear friends, we need a new strategic concept. We have to look really together at strategy. We need solidarity. We don't need unilateral decisions, as President Trump has done in the past. We don't need unilateral decisions, as President Erdogan has done. Please, let's sit together and let's reflect about what I call the European component, the European caucus within NATO, a European defense, yes, but not abolish NATO. It's not his intention at all.
In the days of the Soviet Union, it was easy, right? The top priority was containing the Soviet Union.
And keeping down Germany. Please, don't forget. You remember Lord Ismail, the first NATO Secretary General, what he told: keep the Americans in, keep the Russians out, and keep the Germans down. This was the old NATO concept of the 50s. It's over. But please, it was easier. But we didn't find the right formula to develop a real dialogue, a real partnership with Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. Please, let's not forget this. We were on track towards this. And then after September 11th, we have left totally this line. We did never find any clear view of our relation with Russia at that time. And please then, when you look afterwards, look at Turkey. Turkey was to some extent on track towards coming nearer to Europe, at least, and was a reliable member. But Turkey has one subject which is, let's say, not rational within Turkey. It's the territorial integrity. But Turkey feels threatened by any Kurdish movement that could lead to independence in that area. This could put a question mark on all the borders of the region. And therefore, Turkey is reacting in an irrational way. Where is our dialogue with Turkey about this subject? I think we left, to some extent, Turkey alone. Besides this, it's clear to me, Erdogan has not been an easy president neither.
We'll talk more about it in a moment, but let's go around the table quickly. What is, just so our viewers can be clear for our viewers, what is, I'll go around the table, what is the top priority in your view for NATO? What should be the top priority?
To develop a clear new strategy for the future.
And your view on this, Mireille Clapeau?
Yes, I agree. NATO was built just after World War II, and as you mentioned, the enemy was clear. The enemy was the Soviet Union. Now the world has changed, and there are some other types of wars. There are some other enemies that could be the enemy, but
because the French president was clear. He said, for us, the top priority is fighting terrorism.
Exactly, but even fighting terrorism doesn't have the same meaning for Turkey, for example, and for us. And we saw that the invasion of northeast Syria for President Erdogan was to fight against internal terrorism, against the YPG, the Kurdish, as you mentioned. But for us, the Kurdish, the YPG, were the soldiers that helped us to fight the ISIS. And this, for us, this is the main enemy. But NATO is a collective defense organization, and therefore it has to discuss. There must be a dialogue and a common strategy. Otherwise, it makes no sense. And therefore, the President Macron used the words that you qualified as a harsh word, brain death. Because when you don't know what there is in your brain.
But is it possible among 29 to agree to have because there's a unanimity rule, right, in NATO? You all have to agree on a policy. So is it possible to agree at 29?
But please, we have had in NATO in the past what I call an inner circle, formed by the US, British, French, and the Germans, and that worked well. This does not work anymore. I regret. And in a community of 29. You can't decide in a classical way. You need certain circles who are preparing decisions, who are preparing the dialogue. And I think this was lacking up till now to NATO.
All right. What is the priority for NATO, in your view, Molly McHugh, at this point?
Well, I think your previous guests have hinted at some of the core things. Yes, we need a new strategic concept, but how do we define that? And I don't think it's so much that we need a new strategic concept as we need to refocus on why NATO existed for us. And how do we positively define the values that that are still as relevant now as they were 70 years ago, understanding that the opponent of NATO is still very much the same in that it is Russia. It is the illiberal concept that Russia represents. Joining that now is very much China, sort of advancing this data-driven, technology-enabled version of dictatorship that will be a significant challenge in its many components, militarily, technologically, and otherwise, to democratic countries. And I think understanding that remains the core of the alliance, that that the view of a liberal world order of human rights-driven action and policy needs to remain what we stand for, and that allows us to address these challenges that we've been sort of glossing over and ignoring within the alliance when it comes to Turkey, when it comes to Hungary, when it comes to other nations that are sort of drifting away from some of their commitments in some categories and committing in others. But I think we really do need to refocus on this and understand what we, the West, as we have traditionally defined ourselves, and our allies in Asia and beyond, if we bring in Australia and New Zealand and others, are this core that still exists in terms of defending these values in the world. And while we're squabbling amongst ourselves and governing ourselves less well than we should, we're missing an opportunity to push back on this extremely dark vision of the future that we are otherwise going to lose to. And behind that is a significant amount of military capability. So the two are very much linked, and I think NATO serves as a bridge between our domestic dialogues and our foreign policy dialogues when we're looking at the challenges that we face.
So hang on, let me follow what your reasoning all the way through here, Molly. You're saying that for security, for nations to agree on common security, they have to agree on common values. Does that mean that, well, certain countries don't belong in NATO?
This is why NATO has always existed, a shared view of the values and the principles that NATO is defending and why we are a military alliance. It's why when NATO expanded, the process was slower than many of the new nations would like, because they had to meet the criteria to prove that they're going to defend those values and contribute to the alliance in other ways. So yes, I do believe there needs to be this shared vision of what we are. And, there is no mechanism within NATO to kick members out or suspend them. If you want to withdraw, it's a self-driven process. And I'm not sure that that's the way that we should approach it. Throughout history, there have been NATO members that have sort of fallen off the bench for a while, as it were, with internal civil conflicts and changes in government, and very much come back in. And that's part of because they've been in the alliance, and the alliance has driven them forward and sort of pulled them back to these core values and principles. So I think the alliance is as relevant today as it has ever been. We all just need to remember that. And I think the greater powers within the alliance that are sort of stumbling along for their own reasons right now really need to recommit to leadership within the alliance, to overcoming these little squabbles on things that aren't so important, and really refocusing around the core values-driven leadership that NATO has always been so key to provide.
Little squabbles. Yusuf Farim, let me ask you, what do you think the priority of NATO should be at this point?
You know, we have an American, a German, a French citizen, and a Turk on the panel tonight. Basically, the core of the military core of NATO, barring the UK, Italy, and Spain. And you ask this question to everyone on the panel, and you're going to get a different answer. Even those who answer by saying terrorism view terrorists in a different way. Someone else's terrorist is not someone else's top priority. Someone who I view as a terrorist may not be someone else's top priority. Now, if we all went in a time machine and went back 50 years, you asked the same question, everyone without thinking would say the Soviet Union. So we can already see a divide in view amongst the panelists here. So it's acceptable that obviously the world leaders of the members of the alliance are going to have different views. And for me, the answer would be non-state actors. And from a Turkish perspective, most namely the PKK, because it's the greatest threat to Turkey's territorial integrity and national security. And outside of Turkey's borders, it's Syrian arm, the YPG. Now, Macron said NATO is brain dead. Now, he was onto something. I think he just had a very bad way of communicating what he wanted to say. And I think he diagnosed it wrong. NATO does not need a brain surgeon. NATO needs a psychologist because it's going through a midlife crisis right now. It still thinks it's 40 years old. It still thinks the major enemies, the major targets are Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union, Communist China, but these enemies don't exist. Just like the United States wants to be.
Hang on, you say those enemies don't
again.
exist, Yusuf, but try telling that to the Baltic states or to the Poles who eye Russia warily.
Let me finish. I was getting back to Communist China and Russia. Now, they may be a threat perception to the Baltic states, and most namely, it could be. And that's a bilateral relation that they need to undertake. Now, Turkey does not view Russia as a threat. The Turkish president even calls Russia a strategic partner. There's other European countries that don't view Russia as a threat either, most namely Hungary. Greece is involved in dialogue with Russia. Even France wants to extend dialogue and hold talks with Russia as well. So there's a great divergence in views towards Russia, and NATO should not be used to limit other countries' foreign policies. Now, if Russia wants to be great again, China wants to be great again, that's their foreign policy, and that's their foreign policy and how they are carrying out on a global level. And if they're successful with it, they're successful with it. That's something that needs to be handled bilaterally. Now, terrorism is a threat to everybody. Daesh is a global threat. ISIS, Daesh being the Arabic. Al-Qaeda is a global threat. Now, this is accepted by everyone, but there's also local terrorists, regional terrorism. Now, the PKK is a threat to Turkey. And there's also different examples of terror groups that are regional threats. But just because it's someone else's terrorist does not mean that NATO should say, oh, that's their problem, I don't need to worry about it. That's everybody's problem. This is an alliance. The alliance needs to protect every one of its members. And it's very important that it does protect every one of its members. Now, getting back to the Baltic states, yes. Right.
I'm going to interrupt you, Yusuf, because we have to take a very quick break, but we will pick up on that point. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and as NATO celebrates 70 years with a summit in London, we're wondering what next, an existential crisis, if you will, for an alliance where leaders are at loggerheads over priorities. We're talking about it with Mireille Clapeau, member of the French Parliament and member of its Foreign Affairs Committee in particular, and of La République En Marche, the party of Emmanuel Macron. Former German ambassador to NATO, Joachim Bitterlich, is with us. We're also joined from Washington by foreign policy consultant Molly McHugh, and from Istanbul by journalist and commentator Yusuf Erim of TRT World. Yusuf saying before the break that it's got to be all for one and one for all in NATO. Ahead of that summit, the Turkish president put NATO's support for Poland and the Baltic states in the bargain, support our fight in Syria against Kurdish militias, or else. Let's take a listen to Recep Tayep Erdogan.
I had a call with the Polish president last night, and this came up during the call. They said, can't we, Poland and the Baltic countries, get together in London? We said, of course, with pleasure. We can come together and discuss these issues there as well. But if our friends at NATO do not recognize those against whom we fight terrorism as terrorist organizations, then excuse me, we will stand against any who will be taken there.
So, Yusuf Erim, is that blackmail?
No, it's not blackmail. It's saying, listen, I've contributed greatly to NATO in the 60-plus years that I've been a member, whether it be Korea, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you know what? I need you right now. I want that support reciprocated. And that's what that is. It's a call to NATO members saying, hey, listen, I need you right now. I need you. This is not Article 5, but in NATO, there is an article saying an attack on any NATO member is an attack on NATO. Now, Turkey does not need to initiate Article 5, but Turkey would like to see some support from the countries that it has supported in the past. And I think that's a very reasonable request on behalf of the Turkish president and the Turkish people.
Molly McHugh?
Yeah, I mean, look, Erdogan is getting nice military discounts by doing Putin's work within the NATO alliance, and we just need to call him on that. And, like, the thing with the Kurds is Erdogan is very purposefully asking NATO to weigh into what is not just an issue of terrorism. It is absolutely a domestic political issue for him. And that is not what the alliance does. If the alliance starts settling domestic problems for different leaders, it would be a very different alliance, and it wouldn't be one that would last very long. Erdogan is absolutely putting pressure on the Baltics and on Poland, knowing exactly how reliant they are upon the collective defense treaty for their own security. And asking them to do something that's absolutely impossible, because you'd be delivering on a really crucial realignment in the Middle East that Russia is very much advancing and directing, and which Erdogan is very much trying to benefit from. In one part of the alliance, in the southern edge, and in the northern part, sort of like, if you want us to fight Russia there, then you have to give Russia stuff here. It's just nonsense. I think Erdogan knows it. I think he knows he's in a secure position, sitting within the alliance, making these demands, sort of playing all sides, sort of the maximum definition of strategic depth, which we thought went away, but is still very much there. And it's just, this is completely destructive in terms of what he's asking the alliance to do. And he knows it. He sits within a strong position. Turkey is a significant military contributor to the alliance, and the alliance very much needs that capability. But he cannot sit there playing footsie with Russians, sharing intelligence with the Russians, and pretend that he's still a member of NATO.
Is it a problem, Ambassador Birlich, is it a problem when Turkey buys Russian anti-aircraft missiles?
To some extent, yes. I understand the reaction of the Americans on this. On the other hand, please, we have to understand Turkey at the same time. The key of politics has always been perception, on one side or the other. As we understand here, for example, perception in Poland or in the Baltic states, perhaps exaggerated in our view, but on the other hand, we have to understand it. And at the same time, we have to understand the Turkish perception. Even if we do not agree with certain aspects of Erdogan's politics. But please, we have to understand what the irrational feeling of Turkey towards any threat of its territorial integrity. Therefore, I've been in favor of the German defense minister's proposal to create a zone of deterrence on the border between Syria and Turkey, controlled internationally, in order to help to get this problem under control. But Turkey, on the other hand, has acted in a unilateral way. And the place for such a dialogue should have been within NATO.
Mireille Clapeau, the unilateralism, is it just Turkey or is it also the United States?
Well, NATO should be a collective organization, and there are some rules, there are some rights, some duties, Article 4, Article 5, and it's true that the crisis is due to the fact that first President Trump decided to withdraw the troops without consulting the allies, and second, especially France, and it was seen as a green light by President Erdogan. So there is a crisis again because these two members made some decisions without asking or consulting the other members. But anyway, maybe we should be more positive because NATO made some achievements during this period. There is interoperability of the armies. I'm sure there is a collective will to go further together. And I'm maybe optimistic, but I think that this summit in London is a place to discuss. Maybe it's a place to show the strength and to have some strong words, but it's certainly a place of dialogue.
At least to open a way for real dialogue among the members in order to deal with these potential conflicts.
All right,
this is the key.
And one summit is going to beget another one here in Paris next week. It's going to be a four-way summit between France, the Germany, Ukraine, and Russia.
The Normandy format.
Over trying to de-escalate in the east, where there's a Russian-backed insurgency. How should those NATO members that Molly McHugh was talking about in the Baltic states view that sit-down next week in Paris?
Well, this next week summit is dedicated to the Minsk agreements and to the peace process.
Because when you hear Emmanuel Macron saying, Russia's not the top priority, for us the top priority is fighting terrorism, is that the sign that France is willing to give leeway when it comes to things like recognizing Russia's sovereignty over Crimea, say, or...
No, I think that anyway, there must be a dialogue with Russia. There is a dialogue between NATO and Russia, the NATO-Russia Council, if I am right. So Russia is part of the world. Russia has to respect international rights, which was not done in the Ukraine events. And therefore, there is now a process that has to be respected, that was stopped. But President Zelensky election made some difference, and we have to pursue on with this process.
I think Macron is right.
Yes,
Look
he's
for
right.
renewal of a real dialogue with Russia. And when you talk in Moscow,
Right,
let's
but
say
look,
behind the curtain.
After Crimea in 2014, we played the same game, and at the time there was very much dialogue within the alliance that the adventures abroad, that NATO committing to fight terrorism in Afghanistan, that NATO fighting in Iraq, that these were the wrong things, that it needed to return to being a core territorial defense alliance, and that needed to be the focus of the alliance. And that's sort of where we were. And now it's back out to, oh, well, let's just fight terrorism everywhere, and then we don't need to decide what to do about Russia. We can all just make commercial deals with Russia and build pipelines and make money. And that's not the case. Russia's behavior has not changed. It has not changed as it views the Baltics and Poland. There's a reason that those members of NATO view Russia as a threat. Turkey can sit over there and say Russia's not a threat, but that's not what NATO's core doctrine says. And the alliance does need to be focused on what it has defined as strategic priorities for the alliance, strategic priorities against adversaries that are targeting it, as Russia does. And we need to stay focused on these things. There isn't like a laundry list of like rainbow unicorn enemies in the world that we can decide to fight instead of doing what the alliance is designed to do.
So is the summit in Paris a bad idea, Molly?
I view the summit in Paris as opportunistic. President Zelensky was elected very much saying that he wants to end the fighting in the east, that he wants the war to end. Russia knows this. France and Germany are not sad about this. I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Zelensky to agree to things that will make him take first steps, as opposed to Russia having to deliver anything, as it has not done in terms of the Minsk Accords thus far. And I think that it's not a great idea, but Zelensky is committed to it, and he's the president of Ukraine, and it will be up to his own people to show him if they disapprove of what he's doing. I don't think Ukraine will get out of it what it needs in order to guarantee its territorial integrity, even as currently held. And I don't think Russia has shown any sign that they're willing to change their views on what they view as their objectives in Ukraine, and certainly not in terms of Crimea.
Mireille Clapeau?
Yes, I would like to insist on the purpose of European Union. What we want is to have a security and stability in Europe. And security and stability in Europe needs to be achieved through several ways. For example, last week we voted in the French National Assembly to admit Northern Macedonia as the 30th member of NATO. And NATO is seen in the European Union as an umbrella that will provide stability and security in Europe. It's not the only way, but it's a very important way to reach it.
But you heard Molly McHugh there express doubts over this four-way meeting that's going to be taken.
We have in NATO an agreed concept with regard to Russia, composed by deterrence on the one hand, to show to the Russians, please stop, there are limits, and on the other hand, dialogue. But have we really put this strategy into music? No. What we need is a real dialogue with Russia, even on the subject of Ukraine. We have to discuss it together with the Ukrainians, and I think there are ways and means to develop a solution, perhaps step by step, perhaps not for tomorrow, but step by step to reach a certain stability, to reassure again the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine over the East as a first step, then organize elections, then go step by step to this. And then this is the intention of Emmanuel Macron. And I think he's right. I don't need a new concept for this.
Yusuf Erim, your thoughts on what is right now the only war that's taking place on European soil there in eastern Ukraine?
Now, Turkey is a strategic partner with Russia, but that does not mean it accepts everything or approves of everything Russia does. It does not recognize the annexation of Crimea, and it also has very strong ties with the Ukraine on defense cooperation and many, many trade deals. And obviously, Turkey likes to see stability on its borders, and Ukraine and Russia are both right across the sea from Turkey, and any type of instability is something that concerns Turkey. I also want to address a couple of things that Molly said before. First thing, Turkey's operation in North Syria has tremendous domestic support. And this is not just an Erdogan decision. This is a Turkish state policy dating back 40 years. Any Turkish government would have taken the same decision. So this is the will of the Turkish people and a state policy, not a government policy. I wanted to make that very, very clear. As for the S-400s that was talked about earlier also, Turkey didn't buy the S-400s because it wanted to. It bought the S-400s because it had to. Obama wouldn't sell Turkey the Patriots, wouldn't give tech transfer, wouldn't give favorable financial conditions, and Turkey had no other choice to go and buy the S-400s. Crying about it after it happened, that's not acceptable. The Americans should have solved the deal, solved it before it happened.
But is
now,
it leaking,
from an American standpoint,
it leaking intelligence on NATO hardware to the Russians by doing that?
Well, there is a joint mechanism formed right now, and it's going to be working together with the U.S. and Turkey till April, and hopefully the committee will announce its results on that. Now, also from an American standpoint, I want to get back to what I was saying. Americans like to view everything as black and white, not the gray areas. Like I was saying before, Turkey is partnered with Russia in many aspects, but there's also many aspects where they don't see eye to eye, but they can compartmentalize their problems. Turkey can do that with European countries as well. Unfortunately, the United States, when they look at everything, it's a black or white issue, but that's not the way the world works anymore. It's not a unipolar world anymore. It's a multipolar world. There are regional powers right now, which are the longitude and the latitudes of this new multipolar world. And this is something that America has to evolve to accept in its foreign policies.
All right. The other issue that was brought up, because time is running short, I just want to bring this up because it is important. There was that sit-down between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron where the U.S. president saluted France's engagement in West Africa. Earlier, the NATO Secretary General went a step further.
If France actually comes to NATO and asks for support, then I really expect that NATO allies will consider that very seriously, because NATO allies understand the challenges we all face in the Sahel. And NATO has the structures, we have the command structures, we have done it many times before, we have conducted big combat operations, we have done training, capacity building, building change of commands, intelligence, all of that.
Jens Stoltenberg speaking to our own Douglas Herbert. Joachim Bitterlich.
This is new from his side, to invite NATO to take an active part into the French or the international operations within Central Africa, and thinks European security is beginning there. And therefore France has been asking his European allies from the beginning for support. And please, the United States have been supporting France through drones and other technical means.
So
the British have done it.
So let me ask you about German domestic politics here, because we saw with the killing of those 13 French soldiers in Mali last week that those who are there are German soldiers part of that force in West Africa. There are British, there are Italians.
France has been asking for a more active role of these German soldiers with combat roles within Mali.
Is that going to happen?
It's always a difficult decision with the Germans. Yes, it's a difficult decision because it has to go to Parliament. Parliament has in Germany the last word. But up till now, please note, the German parliament has never refused any demand of a government.
So it could happen.
It could happen for me, yes.
Mireille Clapeau?
I hope so.
Well, France felt a little bit alone in Sahel, and now maybe the world realizes that there is really a common threat. Jihadism is really active there, and well, it's a good news if France can have some help from Germany and maybe from NATO.
Molly McHugh, your thoughts on this? I know the U.S. has that drone base, and they too have lost lives in the fight against jihadist insurgents in West Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's evolved sort of up and down over the past 12, 15 years or so. But the U.S. has been very focused on sort of the Trans-Sahel concept as an important component of security, both in North Africa and then looking sort of northward toward the Mediterranean basin and southern Europe. And I think that our special forces and sort of other special operations capabilities have been doing a lot in Africa. There's sort of a debate within the Pentagon about whether that continues, how to deploy them, where it's most effective. But I think we all sort of agree that sort of looking at the expanded concept of security in Europe and the role that NATO plays within that, that there is this sort of gray zone shelf below NATO that we need to pay attention to when it becomes unstable across North Africa and the band just below in the Sahel. That tends to put a lot more pressure on Europe economically in terms of security, refugees, migrants, other things. So I think absolutely we should talk about this as an alliance and find sort of a good fit solution for everyone in terms of capabilities and deployments and what can be done to actually advance some security objectives there quickly.
Yeah, gray zones. That's it seems also muddled to many viewers. When you think back, roll back the clock 70 years to Washington, D.C., when that new alliance was born in the aftermath of World War II, just as the Cold War was heating up.
The growing strength of Western Union was reflected in large-scale maneuvers by the combined navies, armies and air forces as the European democracies strengthened their ties with the USA and Canada by the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. Washington and President Truman signs the proclamation putting the Atlantic Charter into effect. A momentous occasion calling for souvenir copies for those present and a further token of friendship between the Western powers.
Ambassador Brearley, when you look at that, it seems the past always seems so simple.
The past was a bit simpler than the situation today. And therefore, any alliance, look at Europe even, look at other alliances, need a permanent review, a permanent look at the future. And I think NATO should go with all the confidence of the past into that debate.
All right, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you, Joachim Birulich. I want to thank Mireille Clapeau. I want to thank as well Yusuf Erim for being with us from Istanbul. Molly McHugh in Washington. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there.
Glad you're here, Emma, because there's a point we didn't really highlight much. This is taking place in London. Don't you have a general election in 9 days' time?
Yes, and that means that this particular NATO summit is a real diplomatic tightrope for the incumbent, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson, because Donald Trump is not popular in the United Kingdom, and so if he were to be too effusive in his praise of Boris Johnson, that could be seen as something of a toxic endorsement. This cartoon comes from Christian Adams in the Evening Standard. We've seen very warm, chummy scenes between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump in the past, and this one has, "Hey, old buddy, you in?" and you can see Donald Trump's trademark hair poking through the letterbox, while Boris Johnson's hiding up against the wall. Even Larry the cat is trying to avoid Donald Trump. So it is interesting interesting to see how it's being viewed. A lot of people talking about Boris Johnson desperate, really, to distance himself because at this point in time, just ahead of the election, this could be something that he doesn't want to be looking for.
There's no joint press conference from what I'm told.
No, absolutely. It is all about keeping that distance because Boris Johnson wants to maintain the relationship, but without upsetting the British public. And this is covered very well by Business Insider, talking about how there are fears it could blow up Boris Johnson's election campaign. The polls are narrowing slightly. The Conservatives still very comfortably ahead, but we're getting into the region of, the polls can be wrong. Maybe that Labour could pull this off.
Still 9 points.
Absolutely. The Labour Party, though, very much trying to push the idea that the NHS, the National Health Service, could be up for grabs if there's a Boris Johnson government and a Brexit that is presided over by Boris Johnson, who is close to Donald Trump. Trump has talked repeatedly about wanting the NHS to be part of the trade deal. He's walked back on that today, so he's playing his part. I don't know if he's been briefed by Boris Johnson. I wouldn't like to comment. What he actually said was that he wouldn't want the NHS if you handed it to us on a silver platter. Now, those who campaign against Brexit and against Boris Johnson are reminding us of the kind of things that have been said in the past. Boris Johnson, we're going to do a fantastic deal. Donald Trump, everything is on the table, so NHS or anything else. The Business Insider has also unearthed an old Spectator column written by none other than Boris Johnson, in which he talks about how Trump, basically it shows Trump and the US far from the only threat to free healthcare in the UK. He wrote in his column that free care should only be maintained for the genuinely sick and elderly, and also that NHS services, if they continue to be free, they will continue to be abused. The idea, basically, that if you pay for something, you appreciate it. Now, the idea of the cost, or the concept of the cost of American healthcare to Brits is really not understood, and it's been very, very ably portrayed by Politics Joe on their Twitter account. Take a look at this video.
10 grand for a baby.
Is there a price for that?
Yes.
Jeez, $100, $200?
$2.5 grand. An inhaler.
$100.
Yeah, you're pretty close. It's a bit more.
120.
250 to 350.
For an inhaler?
Yes.
Man, so if you're poor, you're dead.
So if you're poor, you're dead. Strong words there. Now, it's not just the Brits who are walking a tightrope. Emmanuel Macron is, of course, trying to stick to his guns, but also trying to dissuade Donald Trump from putting 100% tariffs on things like cheese and wine. This was Le HuffPost earlier today. Tax a tax, they said. And it basically is retaliation for the French plan to go after GAFA, as they call it here, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, the big tech giants that just so happen to be American. Now, you might expect the French to be outraged at this prospect, but there are also plenty of Americans not happy either. You can take the good wine and cheese out of my cold, dead hands, says this woman, which I particularly enjoyed. This woman raising a different issue, the fact that actually, by putting tariffs on things like cheese and wine, you could put pressure on smaller American businesses, because she points out that 100% tariffs on French wine and cheese doesn't really equate to US tech firms paying just 3% of their profit that they make within France, not global profit here. And she says that will hurt US restaurants, businesses and retail workers because, of course, if they can't afford to pay those tariffs, then they've got to go with maybe that orange cheese that you Americans call cheese.
Well, some do. Some do.
Okay.
Emma James putting her finger where it hurts. Many thanks for that. Donald Trump, by the way, calling it a minor difference, so hopefully it will be resolved. I want to thank Emma. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.